Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to episode 8 of Throwback Thursday, my semi-weekly series about old albums, at least 20 years old. I like to make it. Most are older. Um, yeah, this is my 8th episode, and I'm going back all the way to 1967 for this episode, about 50 years, to the Yardbirds. Okay, now, the Yardbirds, you might have heard before. If you're familiar with music from that time, the song For Your Love was a big hit for the Yardbirds. The song Heart Full of Soul was a semi-big hit for the Yardbirds. But I'm not going to talk about anything like that. I'm going to talk about their album Little Games, which was released. First, I don't know how this is possible, but they don't really know when it was released. It was apparently released either July 10th or July 24th of 1967. And this was their fourth and final real album. They reunited in 2003 for an album called Birdland, which had a lot of different members. And I don't know if you'd really count it as the Yardbirds album. There's a few of them in there, but I mean, really, who cares? This is the last real album by the Yardbirds. The Yardbirds are a very underrated band. A band that was very ahead of their time. As you may know, they had three amazing guitarists in that band. They had Eric Clapton at one point. They had Jeff Beck. At one point, they had Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page. That didn't last very long, though. And then Jeff Beck was kicked out, and Jimmy Page replaced him, so they just had Jimmy Page. This band eventually evolved into Led Zeppelin, which I will get into more later. All right. So this is the first album with Jimmy Page as a quartet. I'll get into a little bit how that came to be. They were a five-piece band. After the album Roger the Engineer the year before, their bass player quit. Paul Samwell Smith quit to become a record producer. So they got this guy called Jimmy Page, who was just, at the time, he was a session musician. He played guitar on tracks for other people. He's played on The Kinks' You Really Got Me. He's played on Baby Please Don't Go by Them. He's rumored to play on I Can't Explain by Pete Townsend, although Pete Townsend swears he plays the solo in it. He's in a bunch of things. Hurdy Gurdy Man by Donovan. He was in a bunch of stuff. Somehow they convinced this really good guitar player to become their bass player for the Yardbirds to replace Paul Samwell Smith. Now, this didn't last long at all because he's wasting his talents on bass. So their rhythm guitarist at the time, Chris Draja, switched to bass, leaving probably the best guitar duo in a band of all time, with Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page playing dual lead guitar for this band. And again, this didn't last very long. They recorded the song Happenings 10 Years Time Ago with this lineup, backed with Psycho Daisies, the single. Happenings 10 Years Time Ago is probably the best song they ever recorded, in my opinion, and one of the best songs of the 60s, in my opinion. Very overlooked. 1966, very ahead of its time. Just a crazy good song. I'll get into that song at some point in another video. Psycho Daisies was the B-side, good song. And they were also in a movie, the other thing they did with this lineup, they were in a movie called Blow Up. And this was a role that was originally offered to The Who, but for whatever reason they couldn't do it schedule-wise. So the Yardbirds did it, and they did a song called Stroll On, which is basically a reworking of The Train Kept A-Rolling, a song that was done it's an old song. It was done in the 50s. It was done by the Yardbirds at one point, a really good version. Aerosmith did it later on. And if you watch them in this movie, you'll see Jeff Beck smashing his guitar. It's because The Who was originally supposed to be in this movie, and that was a very big thing The Who did at the time, was smash their instruments. So Jeff Beck smashed a guitar, so if you want to see something, it was kind of awkward, actually. It just doesn't fit his personality, but it's a really cool version of the song. So, yeah, so after this, Jeff Beck became ill, I guess. He had some illness that prevented him from playing a lot of shows. I personally think that he probably was sick, but he was at the point where he didn't want to play a lot of shows anymore. So he was kicked out of the band. Chris Draja stayed on bass, and Jimmy Page became the sole guitar player, which made them a four-piece with Chris Draja, Jimmy Page, Keith Relf, and Jim McCarty on drums. Keith Relf's the singer. So they brought in Mickey Most, who was a producer who did albums for bands like Herman's Hermits and did some stuff for Donovan. They wanted to, I don't know if it was them or their management, wanted to get a more commercial sound out of the Yardbirds. So that's what happened before this album. Up to this point, up to about 1966, most bands focused on singles. That's what the kids were buying at the time, were singles. Up to about 1966, where things became more focused on albums as a whole and live performances. And at this time, the Yardbirds were playing some pretty different things live. They were doing extended jams. They were I knew they were doing a Velvet Underground cover. I'm Waiting for the Man, which I still haven't heard a recording of. I'm sure they have one on YouTube or something somewhere. It's really interesting. And they're doing some interesting things live, which differed greatly from what they were trying to do with this album. So they were rushed on this album. They wanted to get this album out fast. Their management, the producer, wanted to get this album out fast. So a lot of the songs, in their opinion, didn't sound very good when they came out. Jimmy Page is not a fan of this album. He called it terrible, actually, because he thinks a lot of the songs were like demo quality because they were rushed so much. But I'm a huge fan of this album, so I really want to talk about this. You don't hear much about this album. I haven't seen that much on YouTube about this album. And I told you about Mickey Most. And they used some studio musicians on here, interestingly enough. People like John Paul Jones, who would end up in Led Zeppelin with Jimmy Page. And Ian Stewart, who was a keyboard player. He's kind of like, you've heard of the fifth Beatle before. Ian Stewart was kind of the sixth Rolling Stone. He played piano and keyboards on a lot of songs. And a guy named Nicky Hopkins, who's also a keyboard player, who's a very famous keyboard player from the time, was also a studio musician they used. And they recorded a bunch of songs. There was a few songs they didn't use on the album. Songs like Ha Ha Said the Clown, 10 Little Indians, Goodnight Sweet Josephine, Puzzles, and Think About It, which are all great songs. And they were all released on singles in some form or another. And I actually have a vinyl copy of Little Games I found at a record store that had Puzzles on it. That was interesting. It's some reissue. But all those songs are really good. They're written by other people, I believe. I'm not sure about Think About It, but I think the other ones all are. Think About It actually has a guitar solo in there that Jimmy Page would later use with Led Zeppelin on Dazed and Confused. So if you're interested in that, it's a really good song. You should check it out. So, I think that's all I have to say about the actual album itself. They released a single for Little Games. The title song of the album was the only single that was on the actual album that they released. It reached number 51 in the United States, and it didn't chart at all in the UK. So, there's a thing at this time, for some reason, the Yardbirds were much more popular in the US than in England, where they're from. And it was definitely not that way with other bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Who, Small Faces. Bands like that were all way more popular in Britain, but for some reason, the Yardbirds were more popular in the U.S. Some people attribute it to their. They did a lot of covers of blues songs, but the Stones did that too. American blues songs, but the Stones' first few albums are basically all covers of blues songs. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't get it. But they decided it didn't chart. The single didn't chart in England, so they decided not to release it in England. So they only released it in the U.S. and it peaked at number 80 in the Billboard charts, which is criminal in my opinion. It's not wasn't well received at all. Jimmy Page hated it, like I said, and critics saw it as like a step backwards for the band, which I don't really see. 1967, music was changing a lot, and I think for the most part they went along with these changes. So I don't know. They released it then, and there was a 2 CD release that came out in 1992, which includes the album and all the sessions for this album. 2 CDs, and I have this somewhere. It is really good. If you like this album, you like the Yardbirds, I highly recommend picking this up. Lots of good stuff on it. But yeah, so I'll get to the songs. I'm going to go with the original 1967 album, which was 10 songs, I believe. Which, with all the stuff they recorded, is kind of annoying, but that's what the US did. They usually had 10 to 12 songs on an album. And I'm sure if this album had been released in the UK, it would have a few more songs. Their songs usually around 14. But it wasn't. We only get 10 songs, but 10 great songs. Well, for the most part. Alright. Number 1, the title track, Little Games, was written by Harold Spiro and Phil Lickenmound. I don't know. It was released as a single on March 24th, 1967. Like I said, it didn't chart in the UK. It hit number 51 in the US. And it didn't do a whole lot, but it's a really good song. I like it a lot. The lyrics seem to be about growing up and replacing childhood toys with women. I could see where some women might find this a little sexist. He says, like, Margaret, Josephine, Susie, and Heather, they help me with my little games now that he's grown up. And I'm sure Little Games has its sex. I'm pretty sure. And it's a good song. I like something about this. I love Jimmy Page on this album. His tone, everything on this album's great. I'm trying not to bash Led Zeppelin in this review. But I like Page better with the Yardbirds. So sue me. The B-side of this was the song Puzzles I mentioned earlier, which was recorded for the album but not released on it. And that's a really good song too. You should check that one out. It's on the 2 CD thing I mentioned. And both of these tracks, great Jimmy Page guitar work. Smile on Me is number 2. Now this was a rewriting of Howlin' Wolf's Shake For Me. Howlin' Wolf was an old blues artist which influenced a lot of these British bands like the Yardbirds and the Rolling Stones and the Animals. And Howlin' Wolf actually later recorded the song, reworked the song into his song The Killing Floor, which Zeppelin then took and reworked into the Lemon song. So, yeah, lots of reworking going on. Jimmy Page's guitar solos in the songs, he has 2 of them. And they're fucking blistering guitar solos. They're fucking great. I love them. 2 of the best solos, my favorite solos in the world. Another one of my favorite solos is another Yardbird song, which I'll get to. It's on another album. But yeah, Smile on Me is a great freaking song. 3, White Summer. Now here's we go into some Jimmy Page, negative Jimmy Page things. I love the song. It's a beautiful song. But it's not his song. It's an instrumental. Jimmy Page playing acoustic guitar. They say it's based on Davy Graham's version of this old folk song called She Moved Through the Fair. from 1963. If you go and listen to that song, it's the exact same song pretty much. There's a couple slight differences in places, but it's the same song. And Jimmy Page would run into trouble with doing this kind of thing later on when people realized that a lot of the early Zeppelin songs were not theirs and were credited to them. Well, Jimmy Page was credited on this song as the songwriter for this song. I don't want to bash the song because I really do love the song. I listen to it all the time. He ended up playing it with Led Zeppelin live a lot, and it influenced songs for him that he wrote with Zeppelin. He wrote with Zeppelin like Black Mountainside and Over the Hills and Far Away. Both Zeppelin songs. I don't hate Led Zeppelin. There's Zeppelin songs I like, and there's stuff I don't like. But use someone else's song, give them credit. It's what you do. It's shitty not to. But yeah, it's just Jimmy Page in the song. A guy named Chris Karan is on tabla, which is like an Indian percussion instrument. The Beatles used it a lot on some George Harrison sitar tracks. And White Summer is a really beautiful instrumental song. I love it a lot. But it's the same as his what's his face? The Davy Graham's version of She Moved Through the Fair. Check it out. It's the same song. Okay, Tinker Tailor Soldier Sailor. Now this was a big song as far as Jimmy Page goes. This was the first song he used the violin bow on the electric guitar, which was, people saw as a new thing at the time. People think Jimmy Page was the first one to ever do this, but don't let him tell you that, because he was not the first. Eddie Phillips from The Creation, which is a great, underrated British band, he had done it on the song Making Time a year before that. So it's Eddie Phillips. It wasn't Jimmy Page. So just want to get that out there. I'm probably going to do a Creation album at some point. They're a very underrated band. You like the early Who, you probably like The Creation. Yeah, he did the bowing technique on his guitar. It's based on an old English nursery rhyme. Tinker, tailor, soldier, sailor, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. It's a really good song. It's got a really great bass line. I like the bowing on the guitar. There's not a whole lot to say about this song. It's basically a nursery rhyme, the whole song. It's really awesome, though, and I love it. So I'm not knocking the song. It's a good song. I like it a lot. All right. Now I get to number 5, Glimpses. Now this is probably the most psychedelic thing the Yardbirds ever did. It's an instrumental written by the band for the most part. Keith Ralph, the singer, does some chanting lyrics, I guess, over the fucking great bass line, and the song features multiple guitar tracks, guitar bowing, has an electric sitar, which is barely audible. You really have to listen to it to hear it. And it's just the chanting lyrics in it, but there's a part in the middle. I'm going to read what it says in the middle, because I think it's Jimmy Page talking, and you can barely understand what he's saying. But this is what he says, according to the internet. He says, glimpses of clouds in a forest can review well within us, and never to linger on one is life. Energy radiates from the source. The life around us is but a reflection of our own, flowing within never-ending, boundless infinity. Time is just a cumular limit, which with one glimpse can overcome. I love this song. It's a relaxing song. It's strange. I don't do drugs. This is how I do drugs, is to listen to songs like this, and a lot of songs from them. I don't need drugs when I have these songs. This is an amazing song. And I guess at the time they used to play like 20-minute versions of this song live, which I would love to hear. And I guess the band Smashing Pumpkins did a cover of this live in the 90s. They don't do any of the vocals, though. They just do the music. But this is a really good song. I can't recommend the song enough. It is great. If you like stuff like that, it's great. Okay, number 6, Drinking Muddy Water. This is kind of surprises you after listening to Glimpses, because it's nothing like it. It goes from Glimpses to this, which is this hardcore blues. It's a interpretation of Muddy Waters' Rollin' and Tumblin'. A lot of people have done Rolling and Tumbling. Cream does a version of Rolling and Tumbling on Rollin' and Tumblin', not without G's, on their first album, Fresh Cream, which I will probably get to eventually too, because that's a great album. There's not a whole lot to say about this song. It's very bluesy, has some great slide guitar in it, great guitar in general. Ian Stewart from, like I told you before, the Fifth Rolling Stone, he plays the piano on this song. The Cream version's great, this version's great. Different lyrics in this one about drinking muddy water from a hollow log, but great song. Just kind of a jolt after Glimpses. Okay, number 7, No Excess Baggage. This was written by Brill Building writers, and if you don't know what the Brill Building was like it was a business of songwriters. Bands would get these songwriters to write songs for them. And the ones who wrote this song were Roger Atkins and Carl DeRico. And they also wrote It's My Life by The Animals, which is a great song. It's weird how these two bands kind of shadow each other. And I'll get more into that if I remember later. But it's a good song. John Paul Jones, I forgot to mention, he was also a studio musician like Jimmy Page was. Ended up in the band Led Zeppelin with Jimmy Page. Good guitar in the song, as usual. It's probably like my second least favorite on the album, but I like it. Number 8, getting to my least favorite song on the album, Stealing, Stealing. It is written by Gus Cannon, who was he helped popularize jug bands. It's an American folk song from the 20s, and I don't really know why it's on this album. It's alright, but when you listen to the other tracks that were recorded for this album and weren't put on this album, you're like, why is this song on this album? It's basically a novelty track. The Yardbirds covering a jug band song. It's unnecessary. I don't get it. As you may have guessed, this is my least favorite song on the album. I always skip this song because I don't care. It's alright. If you like it, have fun with it, but not for me. Alright, number 9, Only the Black Rose. I love this song. Keith Relf, the singer, is credited as the sole songwriter for this song. It is classified as a psychedelic folk song. It was written by Keith Relf, I said. It just features him and Jimmy Page in the song. Jimmy Page plays guitar, obviously. And it foreshadows Keith Relf and Jim McCarty, the drummer for the band. When this band split up, they went on to form the bands Together and Renaissance, which is more like music like the song Only the Black Rose. And that's what they did. It kind of foreshadows that, and it's a beautiful song. It's melancholy feeling. It's great. I love the lyrics. It's kind of sad, but good song. Number 10, Little Soldier Boy. Last song on the album, the official album. It's due to time constraints, which I mentioned earlier. When they're trying to rush through recording this album and get it done as fast as they could. Jim McCarty did a vocal track on this album mimicking a trumpet, which was supposed to eventually be recorded over with an actual trumpet. But due to the fact that they were rushing this album out, they just left Jim McCarty's thing. So the trumpet sound you hear in it is actually Jim McCarty mimicking a trumpet. I don't know, it doesn't take anything away from the song to me. It's a good song. It's got kind of a military style drum beat to it. Good acoustic guitars in this. It seems to be about like a toy soldier who's bored with being a toy and wants to get in a war, and he witnesses a war between other toys that he lives with, and at the end he ends up jumping into the fire and dying. I'm assuming he died since he's a toy soldier and he jumped into a fire. It's a weird song. I like it a lot though. It's a good album closer. So after this album failed commercially, although it's probably my favorite Yardbirds album. They released 3 albums in a row. Having a Rave Up, I think it might have been only US, Having a Rave Up. Roger the Engineer, which in the US was called Over, Under, Sideways, Down, and Little Games. 3 great albums simultaneously, and this band is very underrated. After this album, they split up. They toured a little bit after this album in the US, and then they split up. Like I said, Keith Relf and Jim McCarty were really into drugs and LSD and shit, and they wanted to continue doing stuff like that, so they went and formed these bands together in a band called Renaissance eventually. And Chris Drasia and Jimmy Page went on to form the new Yardbirds, which eventually evolved into Led Zeppelin. Chris Drasia ended up leaving. He was replaced by John Paul Jones. Jimmy Page got some session musicians. He had worked with John Bonham, who played on Hurdy Gurdy Man with him. I think John Paul Jones played on Hurdy Gurdy Man with him too. And Robert Plant became the singer, and they became Led Zeppelin. So that's what happened. They basically, like, their first album is basically, Led Zeppelin's first album is basically a Yardbirds album. The same style that the Yardbirds did, just with different people doing it besides Jimmy Page. So, yeah, that's how that happened. It just shows how ahead of their time the Yardbirds were and how criminally underrated they were. I would give Little Games by the Yardbirds, I would give this a 8.5 out of 10. Only because Stealing is on it. And No Excess Baggage, which I like the song, but it's not the greatest, is on it. Take away Stealing, and add 2 of these other songs that were recorded around the same time, like Puzzles, Think About It, Good Night Sweet Josephine, any of these songs. This is like probably maybe a 10 out of 10 album. Just bad choices as far as a couple of the songs, I think. But it's a great album. And if you like the Yardbirds, check it out. If you've never heard them, check it out. If you like Led Zeppelin and want to hear where they came from, check it out. So, and this is an album you don't really hear much about, so really go check this album out. It's a great listen. So that is my review for the week. I will be back next week with another review. Not sure what I'm doing yet, but we'll find out. It'll be a surprise, and you'll be surprised, and all that. Okay, I'll talk to you later. Have a great day.